Grüezi Amerika, Views from the Sister Republic, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brüwiler. Grüezi miteinander, and welcome to a new episode of Views from the Sister Republic. 2025 is a special year in the history of Christianity. Not only is it a holy year for Roman Catholics, a holy year with a new pope, that is, it also marks the 500th anniversary of a movement that has its roots in Switzerland. While many of us, religious or not, Christian or not, took note of the Reformationsjahr 2017, the 500-year celebration of the Reformation, very few in Switzerland, Germany, and Austria are aware of the 2.1 million people worldwide who are celebrating an event that took place in Zurich. On January the 21st in 1525, people witnessed the first adult baptism, or rebaptism. This marked the beginnings of the Anabaptist movement, der Täuferbewegung, or the Wiedertäufer. Anabaptists were persecuted as radicals, incarcerated, and forced to flee their homelands. Nowadays, only 2,000 Anabaptists call Switzerland their home. By contrast, more than 500,000 Americans are Anabaptists, with one group having a particular historic bond with Switzerland. The Amish. Led by Jacob Ammann in the 17th century, the Amish even sound a bit Swiss, still today, as they speak a particular form of German called Pennsylvania Dutch or Amish Shwitzer. But let's explore these descendants of religious refugees with someone who has actually studied them in depth. It's my special pleasure to welcome Professor Stephen M. Nolt to Grüezi Amerika. He's the director of the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania. Welcome to Grüezi Amerika, Professor Nolt.
It's a pleasure to be with you today.
First question that is not entirely off topic, but not the most important one. But how well does someone who studies Anabaptism need to know German?
Well, it would depend upon the groups that one is studying. So your introduction was completely accurate, but we could add to that today, the vast majority of people who refer to themselves as connected to the Anabaptist tradition live outside Europe and North America. They live in Africa and Asia and Latin America, and so they speak a wide variety of languages. Today's typical, if we may say that, typical Mennonite or typical Anabaptist is probably a young woman in Ethiopia or in Congo and is speaking Amharic or a Congolese language or French colonial language or something like that. Here in the United States and in Canada, the majority of Mennonites and others descending from the Anabaptists are by and large English speakers, or they are, again, recent immigrants from other parts of the world and perhaps speaking Indonesian or Spanish, depending upon where they're coming from. But among what we call the Old Order groups, that is the most traditionalist groups, the most culturally conservative and religiously traditional groups, which would be especially the Amish, yes, those groups are still speaking a version of German as their first language. They are all bilingual in English, and we might touch on this later in terms of their education, but like the Amish private school system is actually conducted entirely in English, which surprises some people. But the primary language of the home, the language that children speak, is a Germanic language that for most of them is, as you said, referred to as Pennsylvania Dutch. And maybe we can talk a bit about that. That has a few Swiss connections. And then there was a separate Amish migration of folks from the Jura Mountains, and they speak a somewhat different dialect that's known as Amish Shwitzer.
Amish Shwitzer. It's a lovely name, actually. Whereas Pennsylvania Dutch is often a bit confusing to German speakers until you're aware that Dutch actually should mean Deutsch. So you are fluent in German yourself?
Yes and no. Depends who I'm talking with. I don't necessarily, my German is very rusty. And so, yes, I spent a semester or more in Germany when I was in university and wasn't half bad at one time, but my abilities are limited now. So I'm less less eager to claim that, depending who I'm with.
But you have to use a lot of German words in your research. I've read, among other things, your book, The Amish, A Concise Introduction, which is a great first read for anyone who's interested in getting an overview of Amish history and Amish culture today. And I was struck when I read it how little we talk in high school and in high school history education about the origins and also the upheavals after the Reformation within the Reformation, so to speak. And this might also be a reason why in this First Public we haven't really paid as much attention to the jubilee of the Anabaptist movement as we should have. So I'd love you to take us to the beginnings of the Anabaptist movement. Why were they considered radicals by the reformers themselves?
So the Anabaptist movement would trace its origins, as you said in the introduction, to early 1525. And the key group of people early on are associates of Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich. And they are supportive of his religious reform efforts, his efforts to change aspects of worship and liturgy and preach from the Bible in the German language and move away from Latin and so on and so forth. Married clergy, and we could go on. But they also had a kind of fundamental difference with Zwingli in that they believed that the church should not be an arm of the state, that it should not just necessarily, as a matter of course, include everyone, but should include only those who were committed to being part of the church, as they understood it. In the Christian tradition, baptism is the rite of initiation into the church, and baptism at the time, and still today in many places, in many traditions, is practiced in a way that infants, that very young children are baptized and incorporated into the church by their parents. And in 1524, 1525, this group of religious reformers said, no, baptism should be reserved for those who are making a conscious choice, who are old enough, who are, by some measures an adult, to know that they have joined the church and that they are accepting this as a kind of ethical, moral responsibility to be a member of the church. So this was a radical idea because it kind of cut to the heart of a lot of social understandings of the connection between church and state, of the idea that all of society should be under one religious and political canopy, perhaps with some sort of carve out for Jews or minorities like that. But within Christendom itself, it should be sort of a seamless whole. And so these radicals were kind of pulling at these threads that Zwingli and others thought would unravel all of these connections. And so the argument against, or the reaction to these radicals, was to call them anabaptists. So anabaptist, as a Latin term, ana, the prefix, would mean in English or once again, or as you said, wieder Täufer, so to baptize again. Mm-hmm. And the charge was, look, you radicals, you maybe are, say you're 26 years old. 26 years ago, you were baptized by your parents. Now you're saying you want to be baptized now, so you're engaging in a second baptism. And of course, from the Anabaptist perspective, they said, no, that baptism that happened, say, in my example, 26 years ago, that was meaningless because this was something my parents were doing for me. It wasn't a choice that I made. Well, you can imagine just in that phrasing, that's a very offensive thing to say, for someone to say, well, my baptism was meaningless. No. So there's from the beginning a lot of tension around this. And so the Anabaptists reject the term Anabaptist initially. They say this is a false claim. And of course, for their opponents, the term Anabaptist becomes a really important word, because to be an Anabaptist was a crime, was illegal, and so the term itself has a conflicted history from the beginning. Today, the term Anabaptist, at least in North America, no longer, has that pejorative label, but is more just an overall term for any of the groups, Amish, Mennonite Brethren, and Hutterites and other groups that stemmed from this movement in 1525.
How did the Anabaptists end up in the United States? And how did they even survive the persecution? Because they were heavily persecuted, incarcerated, tortured in Europe.
Yes. So the Anabaptist movement emerges first in and around Zurich. And then due to opposition, active persecution, religious discrimination and harassment, it also pops up in what's now southern Germany, throughout the Rhine Valley, and in the Low Countries of what's now the Netherlands and Belgium. Historians believe about 2,500 Anabaptists were executed in the first 80 years or so of the movement's existence. And so at first, one of the strategies for survival is to migrate, to move to places that are maybe not legally tolerant, but are sort of de facto tolerant. You have a landowner or a member of the nobility who's interested in compliant tenants, regardless of their religious persuasion. So that's one of the strategies. And then eventually there is the migration, for Anabaptists in the Netherlands, there's migration eastward into what's now Poland and eventually into what's now Ukraine. But for those in the upper Rhine Valley of what's now Alsace and Baden and Switzerland, the movement is northward and then across the Atlantic to the west to the colony of Pennsylvania. So of the British colonies in North America, Pennsylvania, founded in 1681, founded by a Quaker, an English Quaker with ties to the English nobility. His name was William Penn, hence the name Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. And he had a vision for a colony that would be a place, again, of religious toleration. He also had a vision for more peaceful relations with indigenous people, with Native Americans. That didn't always work out, not necessarily because of him, but he died in 1718 and his sons did not carry on that vision. So unfortunately, Pennsylvania descended into some of the same conflicts and injustice with Native people that other colonies did. But initially, William Penn was interested in creating almost a kind of utopia. And so this was attractive to a variety of religious dissenters and also people who were economically pushed out. So from 1681 until the time of the American Revolution, there were at least 80,000, perhaps more, 80,000 German speakers who arrived in Pennsylvania. The vast majority of these folks religiously were Lutheran or Reformed, but were people who were economically distressed in the Rhine Valley. But there were also religious dissenters, some German-speaking Quakers, and then also Mennonites and Amish. There were Schwenkfelders, there were radical pietists. And so they end up in Pennsylvania at the invitation of William Penn. Later, there's a second wave of migration of Amish and Mennonites who come after the Napoleonic Wars from about 1815 to 1840 or so. And they tend not to go to Pennsylvania, but go to the area in the U.S. we call the Midwest, the areas around the Great Lakes states, because those were the areas to which Europeans were moving in the early 19th century.
Now, when you're describing these migratory waves, you've already started distinguishing between the Amish and Mennonites as distinct groups of Anabaptists. Yeah. When does that rift or division within the Anabaptist movement occur and why?
So interestingly enough, the Amish emerge as a distinctive group somewhat after actually the establishment of Pennsylvania. So the Amish emerge as a distinctive group in 1693. So if you think about that chronology, when William Penn was establishing Pennsylvania, he couldn't invite the Amish because they didn't exist yet as a group. So the Amish begin in about 1693. And the name Amish comes from the name of an Anabaptist leader in Switzerland named Jacob Ammann. So in the 1670s, 1680s, the Anabaptists in Switzerland are in a sort of paradoxical position. They continue to experience legal and religious harassment from they're mostly in the Protestant canton, so mostly from the Protestant Reformed religious authorities. So they're being harassed, they're being persecuted. At the same time, they are, at that point, they've developed a set of friendships, networks of support from their from their non-Anabaptist neighbors. They've now been living particularly in the canton of Bern, for more than 100 years. They have friends, they have neighbors, and so they are in this position where they are both respected and appreciated by some people, and they are being harassed by others. And it's in that context that a debate emerges, or I guess you could say reemerges, among the Anabaptists of how shall we relate to, quote unquote, the world, wider society. So if we think back to 1525 with the origins of the Anabaptist movement and this idea of adult baptism, they were making a very sharp sense of distinction between the church and state, between the church and wider world. They said, no, the church is only the sort of small group of committed people. So, jump ahead to, say, the 1680s. Well, what happens when, you might say, when this wider world is sort of persecuting you, but also is kind of accepting you? And so this is the debate. And one of the Anabaptist leaders who argues strongly for a sharper sense of separation from the world is Jacob Ammann. We might imagine, although we don't know, but one could imagine perhaps that there's a biographical element here. Jacob Ammann himself and his wife, Verena Stüdler, were converts. They were first-generation converts to Anabaptism. It's clear that they were members in good standing of the Reformed Church near Steffisburg in the Bernese Oberland as late as about 1680. And then after 1680, the state church records show that they are no longer showing up for church. And there are records that say they've been infected by the Anabaptist sect, and they have now become, they've separated from the state church, and they become heretics.
It's fascinating that has been recorded, that they have no longer showed up. There were the various Swiss Reformed churches had these morals courts. That's probably a bad translation of the term, but these groups that met on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis and would report on the moral and ethical activities of the members of the parish, whether they were showing up for church, what they were doing, keeping records, at least in the canton of Bern. So Ammann, he has made, in a sense, the socially costly choice of joining the Anabaptists. And so perhaps not surprisingly, he's arguing for a very sharp sense of distinction between the Anabaptists and wider society. He and many of those who agree with him actually leave the canton of Bern fairly early in, say, 1693. And they moved to what's now the area of Alsace in what's now France. And so there is a migration of many of Ammann's supporters out of Switzerland fairly early on. And so they eventually end up in Alsace. They end up south of there near what's now Montbéliard, France. Some of them end up in Bavaria, in the Palatinate. But some of them do remain in Switzerland. Some of them move further west into the Jura Mountains, where they find some refuge. So that's so the Amish as a distinct group begin in 1693, and so they do become part of this migration to Pennsylvania, starting, we think, in the 1730s, probably, or when the first Amish come to Pennsylvania. And again, then they continue to immigrate through the 1770s. To what extent do these early Anabaptist settlers in Pennsylvania try to keep themselves separate from the rest of society, from the other migrant groups?
A great question that I wish we had better or more specific examples for. One of the reasons that we don't know as much as we'd like is that actually Amish numbers were quite small. I mean, this is a very new group. There aren't actually that many of them. And we can tell from some documents that observers or neighbors or others, refer to them as the Amish Mennonites, like as this is an adjective. This is just a particular kind of Mennonite, which is, not inaccurate. But, how exactly they are living, what they're doing, how distinctive they are is a little hard to measure early on. We do know that by 1775, at least two Amish leaders are signing a document along with Mennonite and some other radical pietist leaders outlining their peace position. So something maybe I didn't mention early on, another thing that made the Anabaptists radical was that they were pacifists. So they're signing this document in 1775 to the Pennsylvania legislature saying why they don't want to fight in the war. So certainly that's something that's distinctive. There are some records that some say early newspaper advertisements or accounts from the 18th century that refer to a particular person, for example, as wearing a Mennonite coat. We don't know what that means. We don't know exactly how their dress was different or distinctive, but it must have stood out in some way that you could refer to this in a newspaper and think that your reader, has an idea. But we're not entirely sure we know that they help to sponsor, I guess you would say, and purchase distinctive Anabaptist devotional books that were either imported or printed in Pennsylvania. But exactly how what their day-to-day lives looked like, unfortunately, is hard to say at this point.
So one of the characteristics of the Amish in the United States that I think continues to fascinate Americans as much as non-American visitors who do encounter Amish settlements or Amish farms, etc., is the way the Amish arrange themselves with modernity, the way they use certain, shall we say, luxuries of modern life, whereas refusing others, etc. From what point on do Americans notice that the Amish are following a different pace of life?
So this sort of separation of Amish life as diverging from most of, lack of a better term, mainstream American life.
Yes, majority society.
Sure, yeah, starts happening in the second half of the 19th century, beginning, the 1850s, the 1870s, and then continues on, and certainly into the 20th century. What happens in North America is that for the Amish and for these other dissenting groups that I mentioned, when they arrive first in Pennsylvania and then in the United States, they find themselves in a more religiously and politically and economically tolerant environment. There's not economically, there's not the European guild system. Religiously, there's not an established church. Politically, American democracy certainly had and has its flaws, but it was a somewhat more democratic system. So all of these things are offering opportunity for assimilation, for adaptation to American life. And so the Amish and the Mennonites, we could go on, but we'll stick with the Amish. The Amish, again, have to, in some ways, not unlike the original debate in which Jacob Ammann rose to the fore in 1693. By the 1850s and 1860s, there's again this debate, what is our relationship to wider society? How integrated or separated should we be? Initially, the first issues that are debated are issues of religious ritual. Should we switch our worship from German to English? Should we switch from singing the old Anabaptist hymns that we brought with us in these Anabaptist hymn books that go back to the 16th century? Should we stop singing those and instead sing Anglo-American gospel songs? Shall we adapt American religious modes like Sunday school? Should we pay our clergy a salary rather than having rather than having lay ministers? In the case of the Amish, should we build church buildings? So the Amish, as a persecuted group in Europe, had never had separate church buildings. They came to North America and they continued to just worship in the homes of members. The members would gather together in someone's home, and that is still the case for the Amish today. But in the mid-1800s, mid-19th century, these are the debates, how much should our religious life change? And the more conservative wing of the Amish movement argued for maintaining die alte Ordnung, the old order, the traditional way of doing things. And so they became known in English as the Old Order Amish, and they are the ancestors of today's, who we would refer to as the Amish today. Not surprisingly, in the decades that followed, those who had taken the more conservative approach in religious life also took a more conservative approach to dress and to technology, to education, to all sorts of other things. So did the Old Order Amish begin by rejecting automobiles? No, because in the 1860s, everyone is using a horse and buggy transportation. So that's something that comes later, but it's not, in retrospect, it's not a surprise that those who were maintaining worship in German in the home, singing 16th century hymns, are also going to be the people who, in the 1920s, are saying it may be okay to ride in a car. Cars aren't evil, but cars aren't something that we're going to purchase and make an everyday use of, because this is a kind of technology that is about the individual, is about individual choice and about individualism. And so we're going to maintain our traditional way of modes of transportation with horse-drawn transportation. So just to use the horse and buggy as an example, that's not the starting point for the Amish. But there is, I think, a kind of a predictable connection between when and why the Old Order Amish in the 19th century maintained a traditional religious way of life, and then their broader approach to technology and to separation from American society in the 20th and 21st centuries.
So the Mennonites took another route. There are also Mennonite churches that one can visit. There is a visibility in that way to the Mennonite community, but they have adapted to modern life, if we want to call it that way, and they are in other ways less visible or less different from mainstream society than the Amish. But what are things that they share in terms of beliefs and maybe also customs?
So Mennonites and Amish today would share some of their basic Anabaptist beliefs, like adult baptism, like a commitment to nonviolence. Generally, an emphasis, although this is expressed in different ways, but an emphasis on the church as a fairly local organization. That is, Mennonites, even if they're not Old Order like the Amish, but Mennonites tend not to have a lot of church bureaucracy, tend not to have a lot of church hierarchy. Some of that as compared with the Amish, but certainly much less than you would find in, say, in a European context, much less than, say, a Lutheran or Catholic church. So Mennonite churches would be much more like in a European context, a local free church structure that's much more grassroots oriented. So those would be many of the similarities, or some of the similarities between Mennonites and Amish. But as you said, most Mennonites in North America have assimilated to American ways of life in terms of technology, in terms of language, in terms of embracing higher education. And also, at a certain point in the 19th and early 20th centuries, became involved with the broader American Protestant missionary movement. And so, again, that's one of the reasons why today there are nearly 2 million Mennonites who are in Africa, Asia, and Latin America who have no Germanic background at all, but would be in some ways the fruit of these missionary endeavors.
To what extent is there a sense of shared kinship between Amish and Mennonite? Is there a sense still that one is, in spite of the rifts in history, a sense of shared history, a sense of commonality? That's
a question that we'd answer, I suppose, differently depending upon where you are or where you're situated, because in an area, say, such as where I live now in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where both Amish and Mennonite people have lived for a long time, 300 years or so, in which we haven't talked about this yet, but about 85% of children born to Amish parents join the Amish church through adult baptism. Mm-hmm. About 15% roughly of Amish children do not. And so they might join no church at all, or they might join a Pentecostal church or whatever. But some of them may join a Mennonite church. So in other words, my point is, over this 300 years, there's a certain amount of intermarriage that has happened as well. So in a place like Lancaster, where Amish and Mennonite people have both lived for a long time, in which there are some family connections, I think there's a certain sense of a recognition of that sort of shared identity. If you go to, say, New York City, where there are a number of Mennonite churches that have been started by Mennonite professionals who moved to New York for university or for employment or something, and there are no Amish around. I imagine that the sense of connection is pretty thin. Likewise, as the Amish community has grown and expanded, and there are now more Amish communities in rural parts of North America in which there are no Mennonites living, anywhere close to them. So there are now Amish settlements that have started in parts of, in 32 states, there are at least some small Amish population. And so you could go to a state like Missouri, where there are very few Mennonites, but now there are a fair number of rural Amish settlements. Those Amish people probably, don't have a lot of connection or sense of connection to Mennonites just because of where they're located now today.
You've already mentioned that the Amish are actually growing, and this is something that does not cease to amaze my students when I talk about the Amish and their legacy, because it's surprising to many in this day and age that you mentioned the number 85% of the young would decide to become baptized themselves and become part of the community, the Gemeinde. How is that to be explained? Why is this old order so permanent?
The sociologists would say the retention rate is about 85%. So that varies from, it's not an across-the-board number, but that's sort of typical average, many places. And I think scholars would credit it to several things. One is that there is just a kind of profound socialization that children experience growing up in a community in which you are speaking a distinctive language. You are different from your non-Amish neighbors, just to use language as one example. Your customs are different. So you develop a peer group that is largely Amish. Now, clearly, this is not something that just railroads everyone into that decision. It's not 100% retention, and there are 15% may seem like a small percentage, but say in a place like Lancaster, the Lancaster Amish community here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 44,000 Amish people. It's adults and children. But with every generation, 15%. That's I'm not able to do the maths right here on the tip of my tongue. But in every generation, it's not a small number of people. So there are also people who are leaving, who are not joining. So there is this element of choice. But I think it's clear that the kind of socialization, religious socialization, and I guess just social socialization that children experience in the Amish community is something that is appealing. And again, you're finding your peer group. You're thinking perhaps about marriage and who are who possible marriage partners are. These are likely going to be people within the Amish community who share your values, and so there is a sense in which, although this is not predetermined and people aren't forced to make this choice, there is a sort of social funneling effect that I think does encourage youth to join the Amish church, even though certainly not everyone does.
What's also fascinating is how Pennsylvania Dutch and Amish Shwitzer have survived into the 21st century, because normally we see that after 3 generations, the language of the ancestors is starting to be forgotten. How is the vitality of Pennsylvania Dutch? Do you see it survive into the next generation as well, the next century maybe even?
I would say the answer is yes, but I will also just right here say you should, as another guest, you should invite Mark Loudon from the University of Wisconsin, if you haven't, for this show, because he's a real expert on Pennsylvania Dutch, and so he would be able to speak with more authority than
I think we should do that. Yeah.
So Mark would say that although there is some borrowing of English terms into Pennsylvania Dutch today, that is not a sign that the language is dying out. That's a sign that the language is a living language. That it is in the same way that modern contemporary German in Germany actually includes a lot of French words, words of French origin or English origin or so on. People incorporate words into a language when they are using that language, when the language is growing and alive. And so Pennsylvania Dutch does incorporate English terminology now, but not at a particularly remarkable percentage or rate. Again, Mark would say. And so it's very much the language of the home. It's the language of the church. And I think that connection to religious ritual is probably also important to the ongoing use and survival. My understanding is that Pennsylvania Dutch, as it is spoken today, has actually it doesn't have a lot of very specific links to Swiss German, but there are some. So, for example, my understanding is, you would know this being in Switzerland, but the Amish would use dir instead of ihr for a second person plural, which is apparently more of a Swiss German use of that pronoun. And also use the diminutive ending li, like maidli for a little girl or for any kind of diminutive. Yeah. So there are a number of very specific connections to Swiss German, but perhaps not as many as you might expect. And I think that comes from the fact that what we now call Pennsylvania Dutch is a, shall we say, language or a very clear geographic dialect language that really did kind of develop in Pennsylvania among a lot of German speakers from throughout the Rhine Valley, and so it's more than just Swiss German.
I always listen to bits of Pennsylvania Dutch with my students, and those who come from the Palatinate, from Pfalz, have noticed that there are expressions that are common in their region, but that would not be part of Standard German or the Swiss dialect. For instance, the term Bauerei for Bauernhof or farm, that's apparently from the Palatinate. I learned that through a student. What is also an interesting story is how the American state relates to the Amish. We haven't touched on this. We've talked about the very painful history of Anabaptists in Europe, but we kind of glided through their arrival in America. That sounded very promising, but there have also been major conflicts with the American state when it comes to serving the country in the military, as well as to schooling. You mentioned in your book that there are nowadays still 2,000 one- and two-room Amish schools in the U.S., that the Amish have been able to, quote-unquote, opt out of the public school system. But this has been fought for very hard by a people that does usually not fight. How have the Amish been able to still get their rights vis-a-vis the American state without actively fighting for them?
To begin, just to clarify for European listeners, education in the United States in our federal system is something that's handled at the state level rather than the national level. So the Amish conflict over schooling is one of the reasons it was such a protracted struggle was because it took place time and again in one state after another. Anyway, so that's part of that story. Amish children, Amish parents, Amish families participated in public education from the advent of public education in the United States beginning in the 1830s, when public education began here, up through about the mid-20th century. So they participated in rural public schools. They didn't have their own separate schools. They didn't set up parochial schools in the way that Catholic and some Lutheran immigrants did. They just participated in the rural public school system as their other neighbors did. Again, something else to know about the American public school system is that it was not only at a state level, but also within many states, there was historically a sort of two-tiered system in which in urban areas, public schools included grades 1 to 12 through a high school and college preparation and so on. But in many rural areas, public schools ended with 8th grade until about the advent of 1940, roughly. And so Amish participation in public schools did not mean that they were going to high school or university. They were participating in the rural public school system, which was somewhat different. In roughly the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, throughout the United States, there was a concerted effort to try to equalize public education, to make rural public education the same as urban and so on. And it's at that point that a number of these conflicts emerge in which there's school it was called consolidation. So they were going to close all the rural public schools, use school buses to transport rural students into towns and cities with a more unified curriculum into much larger schools. And at that point, Amish parents said, no, we have no problem with the public school curriculum as it existed, but we don't want our children taken out of the community. We don't want them to go to schools where we don't know who the teachers are. Again, in the past, Amish children had gone to schools. They didn't have Amish teachers, they had non-Amish teachers, but these were people in a local community who were in a local rural community who were known. So they said and there were other changes to the curriculum. In some cases, advent of science teaching that included the teaching of evolution that Amish parents disagreed with. So, I mean, in other words, things like the curriculum, that wasn't necessarily the key issue, but that was one of the issues, sort of an accumulation of issues of change around education. And so to take Pennsylvania as an example, where I live in the state of Pennsylvania, this struggle over Amish schooling was for about a 5 or 6 year period from 1949 until 1955. Amish parents said, we want to keep sending our children to the schools that we've always had, rural schools with this public school curriculum. And in 1955, the state of Pennsylvania said, okay, you can do that. Your schooling can stop with more or less with 8th grade. It's a little more complicated than that. But anyway, you could go to 8th grade, you'll retain this public school curriculum. So that's one of the reasons why in Pennsylvania, it's the reason why in Pennsylvania, Amish schools are conducted in English. Because they were maintaining this, circa 1949 rural public school curriculum. It's in English. It focuses on reading and writing, grammar, penmanship, mathematics up through pre-algebra, geography, some history, not a lot of science. There aren't separate music and art classes, although students do drawing and they do sing. But the way the day is structured, the way the curriculum is set up, is very much like rural public schools in Pennsylvania in 1949. And so the state of Pennsylvania in 1955 said, that's okay, you may have that in a sense, that sort of separate dispensation as you're continuing. Amish schools are not, again, they are not religious schools in the sense that there's no religion class. There's no teaching, explicit teaching of theology. There is a reading of several Bible verses at the beginning of the day. But again, in 1949, public schools in rural areas also began the day with a bit of Bible reading. So again, that's not something that's uniquely Amish. That's something that would have been part of the older rural public school system in Pennsylvania. So that conflict then played out a few years later in Ohio and in Indiana. And Ohio eventually adopted did what the Pennsylvania state government did and granted the Amish this exception. Indiana did, several other states did. The state of Wisconsin, to make a long story short, the state of Wisconsin then dug in its heels and said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to make this Pennsylvania compromise. And so that case, this gets to your question of how do the Amish people fight the people who don't fight, was actually a group of non-Amish advocates. One of them was actually a Lutheran minister named William Lindholm. And he and some other non-Amish advocates organized a legal group that went to court on behalf of the Amish versus the state of Wisconsin. And that case went to the U.S. Supreme Court. Again, education is usually not a federal issue in the United States, but this went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court told the state of Wisconsin that they did not have a compelling reason to not adopt the kind of approach that Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and other states had. And so since 1972, basically every state has had some sort of version of what had been worked out in Pennsylvania in 1955. So yes, today there are several thousand Amish schools. They tend to be one-room schools or two-room schools, again, on the model of a mid-20th century rural public school with a curriculum that is like those mid-20th century public school curricula.
You've outlined the curriculum that they would follow, that there is a bit of history. To what extent is there a sense of history and a sense of a history of suffering and a history of pain within the Amish community? Or does that not really matter? Is that one of the things that they observe with? You've used and explained this concept several times in the book, and I love it because our time lacks it, namely Gelassenheit, so that you don't reflect on that too much collectively.
Yes. So this concept of Gelassenheit, or which can be, I suppose, in English, rendered as either resignation or acceptance. The Amish would refer to it as submission in English. So you are submitting to God, to the church, to tradition, to older members of the community. And I think it does have implications for their thinking about their own history and a history of suffering. There may be two different ways that these maybe seem to be in contrast, but I guess it illustrates the complexity of Amish life. On the one hand, there is a keen knowledge of that history, of that past. There is a sizable book, church history book, that is found in not every, but most, the vast majority of Amish homes, that is known in English as the Martyrs Mirror, the Martyrspiegel, a reflection on the martyrs, that is known and read, owned, used, and it is certainly, as the title would suggest, a history of suffering. At the same time, Amish people today are often, at least Amish people that I know and interact with, are often very quick to say, we are very appreciative of the freedom, of the opportunity, of the toleration that we are experiencing here today. So they don't, in my experience, they don't on a day-to-day basis go around feeling like they're victims. But at the same time, they do have an awareness of that history.
I feel like I could ask you a dozen more questions, but I don't want to overstay my virtual welcome. But to conclude, I'm still nosy, and American pop culture seems to be never-endingly fascinated with the Amish. There are very trashy reality TV documentations like Breaking Amish, Amish Mafia. There are very weird romance novels set in Amish country, etc. What does someone who studies Anabaptism and the Amish make of all these? Why is there this nearly strange obsession with the Amish that we don't see with other minority groups?
It's a great question. And again, there maybe would be some other guests I could recommend to you who could also speak to this.
I need an Amish
question.
spinoff.
Yeah. But I'll just mention two things. One is that at least here in the United States, there is a very strong myth. I mean, I use that term descriptively. One of the great American myths is the myth of the melting pot, the myth of assimilation, that assimilation is inevitable and it is benign, and everyone wants to assimilate and will. And so when you have a group that doesn't assimilate, I think it catches people's attention, at least here in the United States, what's going on. So that's one of the elements. I think another element, and maybe this is just a variation on that, but I think that the Amish relationship to technology is also something that catches people's attention. And it is not that Amish people reject all technology, and that's a whole other conversation we could have. And I'll just add that the Amish population in some ways is very uniform, but in some ways also diverse. So it's very difficult to say what technologies do the Amish use or don't use, because when you really get down to the details, there's a lot of variation of what kind of technologies are used or not used. But it's also fair to say that in general, Amish people are resisting the technologicalization of American life more than many of the rest of it. So I think that's something else that people find intriguing.
A sense of purity, maybe, that they also associate.
But one of the things that this then creates, and another scholar named Dave Weaver Zurcher, who also lives here in Pennsylvania, has written about this contrast in popular perceptions of the Amish, in that this fascination with the Amish has led to a sort of toggling back and forth between the Amish as too good to be true and too bad to be believed, right?
Oh,
in other
hence
words,
the Amish mafia.
right. So the Amish are presented as either unbelievably pure and idealized, which is not Amish life, or that they are the worst kind of hypocrites because they are actually, they have so many flaws and they're just like covering them up. In fact, Amish people rarely cover up their flaws. They are as aware of their problems as anyone else. So, but I do think that speaks to, let me put it this way: popular images and presentations of the Amish typically say more about wider American society than they actually do about the Amish. And so, whether one sees the Amish as highly idealized, people of paradise, or whether one sees them as cynical hypocrites, probably says more about one's own anxieties about the American past or future than it does about the Amish.
That's a wonderful phrase to end on. Thank you so much, Steve Nolt. One final PS question. Our listeners are probably as intrigued by the Amish now as I have been for a very long time. Where would you recommend them to start reading? What could they watch or listen to better understand the Amish?
Here at the Young Center, we have a website that we maintain with both some statistics, because we get a lot of questions about how many Amish people are there, as well as just general information about the Amish. I could send you that link if you want to put that in the show notes.
I have already that in the show notes. So
okay,
no
all
problem.
right. So that's one place that I point people to. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time, Steve. Greatly appreciated it and opening up the panorama of Amish history and present. Thank you to you in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. And maybe we'll continue this conversation about the Amish at another point.
Thanks for inviting me.
And with that, I say thank you to all our listeners and auf Wiederhören when we again have another episode of Grüezi Amerika.
Grüezi Amerika, views from the Sister Republic, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brüwiler.